Good evening. Let's drift back. Not too far in time, but far enough to feel like another world entirely. A world built on dreams of equality, yet weighed down by the cold machinery of control. Welcome to the Soviet Union. Not the military parades or the propaganda posters, but the quiet, ordinary life lived behind those thick apartment walls. Imagine waking up in a small, one-room flat in Moscow, Leningrad, or maybe some nameless industrial tower east of the Urals. The air is chilly, because the radiators only half work. And your blanket smells faintly of coal dust from the heating plant down the street. On the table sits yesterday's bread, dense, black, and a little stale, and maybe a jar of pickled cucumbers, if you were lucky enough to get some from the market before they ran out. This was daily life for millions of people. Not glamorous, not heroic, just survival Soviet style. There's a phrase that was common in those years. We pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us. It captures everything about the rhythm of life in that strange, self-contained world. Everyone had a job, yes, but not everyone had purpose. Factories churned out thousands of identical boots that nobody wanted, or machines that didn't quite work. It didn't matter. As long as production quotas were met and paperwork was stamped, and yet, beneath all of that, life went on. People fell in love, children laughed in playgrounds, and families huddled around tiny black and white TVs, catching the latest ballet broadcast or news of another Soviet space triumph. Ordinary joys found their way through the cracks of the system. When you stepped outside in winter, you'd hear the distant clanking of trams and the sharp whistle of the wind across the frozen courtyards, apartment blocks. Those massive grey rectangles stretched endlessly in every direction. Every building looked the same. Every stairwell echoed with the same muffled voices. The same smell of boiled cabbage and kerosene, and yet, within those identical boxes, each life was different. A factory worker keeping a secret stash of American jazz records. A teacher trying to teach history without offending the senses. A grandmother knitting quietly, remembering that Tsarist days she wasn't supposed to talk about. That was the paradox of Soviet life. Public uniformity, private rebellion, everyone was expected to act the same. But behind closed doors, individuality never fully disappeared. There was, of course, the endless queue, that most Soviet of experiences. Lines for bread, lines for meat, lines for anything that might still be on the shelf by the time you reached the front. People waited for hours, sometimes all day, swapping gossip, rumors, and recipes. The long queue was a sign that something was available, and that was reason enough to stand in it. And through it all, there was this quiet endurance, a kind of stubborn calm that ordinary Soviets developed over decades. Life might not have been easy, but it was theirs. They laughed, they loved. They endured, and in the strange stillness of those endless apartment blocks, humanity found a way to survive the system built to control it. If there's one sound that could define the Soviet Union, it might be the shuffle of feet in a queue. You'd see them on every street corner. Long, winding lines that seemed to appear out of nowhere. People didn't even ask what the line was for anymore. If there was a line, there was probably something worth waiting for. Sugar, maybe, or a few bars of soap, or, on a lucky day, a bundle of oranges from Georgia, their smell cutting through the cold air like sunshine from another world. Waiting in line wasn't just a nuisance, it was social life. Old women traded rumors about who'd been promoted or who'd been quietly rested last month. Children learned patience the hard way, clutching ration cards in mittened hands. Men smoked and stamped their feet to keep warm. It was the Soviet version of a public square. A place where people connected, quietly, under the watchful eyes of no one and everyone. You might think that in a system so centralized, efficiency would be king. But no, the Soviet Union ran not on efficiency, but on paperwork, endless forms, rubber stamps, approvals. And counter-approvals. You needed permission to buy a car, to move apartments. Even to visit another city, there were jokes about the bureaucracy. Of course, in the USSR, one went, everything is forbidden unless it is compulsory. And yet, people adapted. They always do. If you couldn't find what you needed through official channels, you turned to Blatt, a kind of informal favor network that quietly greased the wheels of the system. Maybe your cousin knew someone at the shoe factory. Maybe your neighbor had a friend who could get you a part for your car. Money helped, but connections helped more. Blatt was the invisible currency of Soviet life, more powerful than rubles ever could be. Then there was the apartment, the communal car, or communal flat. Imagine sharing a kitchen with 5 other families, each with their own schedules, smells, and temperaments. Every family had its own shelf in the fridge, its own cupboard space, its own locked drawer. Privacy was a luxury. Arguments about dishes or noise were constant. But so was a certain camaraderie, a reluctant, noisy togetherness. If someone was sick, the neighbor would bring soup. If someone's child had a birthday, everyone in the hallway would hear about it. Life in a communal apartment was a balancing act between frustration and familiarity. It forced people to live side by side, day after day, through every inconvenience. And in a strange way, it created a sense of collective resilience. You couldn't escape each other, so you learned to endure each other. And what about leisure? What did people do to unwind in a society where even fun was supposed to serve the collective? They went to the cinema. Of course, Soviet films were often moral tales, with heroic workers and loyal soldiers, but sometimes, buried between the propaganda, were stories that felt real, stories about love, humor, and small human moments. Those films became classics, whispered about, rewatched on crackling VHS tapes decades later. And there was music, officially approved music. Sure, military marches, patriotic songs, folk ensembles, but beneath it, there was something more daring. Bootleg rock records smuggled in from the West, copied onto X-rays because real vinyl was too expensive. These bone records, then, ghostly images of skeletons with forbidden tunes burned onto them, became tokens of quiet rebellion. Imagine holding up a translucent image of someone's ribcage. Hearing Elvis or the Beatles hum through the scratches, it was forbidden, fragile, and utterly alive. In the end, that's what Soviet life was about. Survival through improvisation. When the state failed to deliver, people filled in the gaps themselves. They built lives out of scarcity, humor out of hardship, and hope out of monotony. And as night fell over those grey apartment blocks, you'd hear laughter echoing faintly through the walls, proof that even in a system designed to suppress the soul, the human spirit found ways to sing. Let's step into a quieter scene. A small Soviet apartment, maybe in the early 1970s. It's morning, and the smell of semolina porridge fills the air. A child sits at the kitchen table, bundled up in layers, staring at a chipped cup of tea while their mother tightens the scarf round their neck. Outside, snow drifts down through the grey light, and somewhere in the courtyard, a loudspeaker plays a patriotic song about Lenin. This was a typical childhood in the Soviet Union. Disciplined, structured, and deeply intertwined with the state from the moment a child could stand in line. They were part of something bigger. Kindergarten wasn't just about naps and toys. It was about learning to march in formation and sing songs about tractors, pioneers, and the bright future of socialism at school. Mornings began with the pledge to serve the motherland. Teachers were strict. Textbooks were heavy with ideology, and history was taught not as a story of discovery, but as a lesson in loyalty. There was no room for maybe or perhaps. The revolution was glorious, the party was wise, the future was certain, of course, behind the slogans and the portraits of Lenin. There were real teachers, tired, patient, often underpaid, who quietly tried to make lessons interesting. Some even dared to slip bits of forbidden poetry or real history between the official lines. And the students, they were just kids. They passed notes, they whispered in class. They dreamed of chocolate bars and Western jeans. Some of them would grow up believing every word they were taught. Others would start to question, carefully, quietly, maybe only to themselves. There was a whole system of youth organizations designed to shape those young minds. First came the Octobrists, with their little red star badges. Then the young pioneers, in their crisp white shirts and red neckerchiefs. They camped in forests, sang songs round bonfires, and listened to speeches about the greatness of Soviet science. Later came the Komsomol, the youth wing of the Communist Party, where ambition met loyalty. Membership wasn't exactly optional. If you wanted a good job later, or a chance at university, you joined. It was the way things worked. At home, life was simple, sometimes painfully so. Most families had little, but made the best of it. Parents might save for years to buy a washing machine or a small television. Furniture was heavy and plain, built to last forever, though it rarely matched. Wallpaper peeled, but was patched up with love and stubbornness. On holidays, people went to the dacha, a small countryside cottage where they grew vegetables, relaxed and, if lucky, escaped the watchful eyes of the state for a while. Children loved the dacha. There, they could run barefoot, pick berries, and chase dragonflies while their grandparents tended to the garden. It was a slice of freedom, a private world of fresh air and quiet, far from the grey geometry of city life. But childhood wasn't all innocent. Every child knew there were things you could say at home, and things you could never say at school. You didn't talk about your parents' complaints. You didn't joke about the government. You didn't question why your father's friend suddenly moved away and never wrote again. Even young children learned this silence, the quiet self-censorship that became second nature. And yet, for all its restrictions, childhood in the Soviet Union wasn't without warmth. Families were close, neighbors looked out for each other, and every small joy was cherished. A new pair of shoes, a banana in winter, a postcard from a relative in the army. It was a life built around scarcity, but also round meaning. Because when you don't have much, what you do have, friendship, laughter, a little cup of tea, feels infinitely precious. And when night fell, as the streets emptied and the lights dimmed, a parent might sit by the window, listening to the hum of the radiators and the faint crackle of a radio from the next apartment. Somewhere, beyond the iron curtain, there was another world, one filled with color and choice. But for now, this was home. Grey, cold, controlled, and deeply human. Morning in a Soviet city began with the sound of boots on concrete. The same streets, the same grey apartment blocks, the same faces waiting at the bus stop under a low sky. Somewhere, a radio crackled with the national anthem, faint, tinny, coming from a window to floors up. The buses were always crowded. Steam fogged the glass. The air smelled of wet wool and engine oil. For most people, life meant work, not as a dream, but as a duty. The Soviet Union was built on the idea that labor itself was sacred. He who does not work, neither shall he eat, Lenin had declared. And so everyone worked, whether they believed or not. Factories, ministries, collective farms, the great Soviet machine depended on millions of ordinary hands doing ordinary things, day after day. You could be a machinist in Magnitogorsk, a tram conductor in Leningrad, a typist in a dusty government office, or a teacher in a remote Siberian town. The job titles changed, but the rhythm stayed the same. Punctuality was a civic virtue, productivity a patriotic duty, and yet, behind the slogans, work often meant long hours, low pay, and endless bureaucracy. Still, every worker had their pride. Factories were like small worlds, with their own traditions, heroes and gossip. There was always someone who could fix a broken machine with nothing but wire and willpower. Someone who hoarded spare parts, cigarettes, and secrets. The best workers earned medals, hero of socialist labor, for hitting impossible. Production quotas. They were paraded in newspapers, their faces glowing with idealized sweat. But everyone knew the truth. The numbers were always adjusted. The machines broke down. And the 5-year plan often became a 7-year improvisation. There was an art to surviving. In this system, an entire unofficial economy of favors, connections, and quiet trades. You needed shoes. Maybe your cousin's friend worked at the factory that made them. Needed better meat. The butcher could help, if you brought him something in return. This was called blatt, a word that meant personal networks. The quiet web that held Soviet life together when the state failed to deliver, the state promised. Equality, but blatt created a hidden hierarchy. The one who knew the right people could live far better than the one who didn't. Everyone pretended not to notice. You never spoke about it openly. But you played the game, because that's what survival looked like. Evenings were quieter. After the long workday, people came home to their cramped apartments, made tea, watched state television, and listened to programs about achievements. New dams, new satellites, new factories. The propaganda was constant, like background noise. It told you how lucky you were, how strong the nation had become, how bright the future was. But people learned to listen between the lines. A joke told in the right tone. A pause in a newscaster's voice. A glance exchanged at the dinner table. There were moments of real pride too. When Yuri Gagarin went to space, the whole country wept with joy. When the Red Army beat Nazi Germany, every family felt part of something eternal. These were genuine triumphs, built not on illusion but on sacrifice. The Soviet people had achieved miracles at a cost so immense it could never be repaid. And so they kept moving forward, day by day, in that strange balance between faith and fatigue. Because that's what being Soviet meant, to believe, at least a little, even when you knew better. There was warmth in the coldness, in the factories. Workers sang together, on trains. Strangers shared food. On New Year's Eve, neighbors toasted to health and peace under faded tinsel. The hardships didn't destroy the sense of community. They deepened it, and somewhere, quietly, change was coming. In the late-night whispers, in the smuggled records from the West. In the questions young people began to ask their parents, questions that no one had answers for. The system could command work, but not belief. It could ration food, but not curiosity. It could fill factories with noise, but not silence the human heart. By the 1960s, the fires of the revolution had cooled into habit. The slogans were still painted on factory walls, but the paint was peeling. The portraits of Lenin still hung above every classroom and meeting hall. But most people stopped looking up at them. The Soviet Union had entered what later historians would call the era of stagnation, a time when everything worked just well enough to keep moving, and just poorly enough that everyone felt it. Yet daily life went on. The average Soviet citizen in 1975 woke up, made tea, caught the tram, and went to work. They collected wages, queued for groceries, and came home to their family in a communal apartment or a prefabricated housing block known as a Khrushchevka, grey, boxy, but warm. These buildings spread across the country like concrete mushrooms, promising every family a separate apartment for millions. It was their first private room. It was freedom measured in square meters. Inside, the decor was identical from Leningrad to Vladivostok, a wall unit with glass doors displaying a small china set, a red carpet with geometric patterns, a radio or record player, maybe a black and white television, a potted plant that never quite survived the winter. People made their homes cozy. They always did. They built small worlds within the giant machinery of the state. Television had replaced the radio as the voice of authority. Each evening, families gathered to watch the nightly news, which reported that everything was wonderful. Grain harvests exceeded targets. Workers broke new records. Factories were opening everywhere, and people nodded. Not because they believed it, but because disbelief was exhausting. They lived into realities. At once, the official one, where the future was glorious, and the private one, where the washing machine broke again, and sausage hadn't appeared in stores for a month. Still, there were good moments. Summer vacations on the Black Sea, picnics in birch forests, films from Mosfilm that everyone quoted by heart. There was laughter, romance, music, and a strange, melancholy pride. The sense of being part of something immense, something flawed but still alive. The Soviet Union wasn't just a government. It was a mood. Work became ritualized. Factories ran at half efficiency. Meetings produced endless resolutions no one read. But there was an unspoken agreement. You pretend to work, and we'll pretend to pay you. For many, the real work happened after hours, not in the office or the factory, but in the garage cooperatives and dockers. These were private escapes. The dacha, a small country cottage, became the Soviet citizen's paradise. A few square meters of soil, a shed, a garden, a place where you could grow cucumbers, tomatoes, and dreams there. People laughed freely. They gossiped, grilled shashik, and listened to forbidden rock music on battered cassette players out in the birch woods, far from the grey blocks of the city. Life felt lighter. It felt human again. Music was rebellion in soft form. The Beatles, Deep Purple, ABBA, all copied onto cheap magnetic tapes called magnetized. They passed from hand to hand, sometimes literally recorded on discarded X-ray film, ending the name music on the bones, Western voices singing through the static. It felt dangerous. It felt alive. And yet, even as the system decayed, there remained a quiet decency among the people. Doctors who worked miracles with no medicine, teachers who stayed late after class, scientists who pursued their research despite absurd shortages. They knew the slogans were empty, but they kept going. Not for the party, but for each other. There was a strange peace in that long afternoon of Soviet life. The empire no longer expanded. The ideology no longer inspired. But there was stability. And for a generation who had lived through war, famine, and terror, stability was enough. They didn't yet know it. But history was already shifting beneath their feet. All prices would fall. The war in Afghanistan would drain resources, the promises of the revolution. once carved in stone, were now written in dust. Still, in 1980, as Moscow hosted the Summer Olympics, the city gleamed, flags fluttered, the crowds cheered. For a moment, it looked like the dream had survived. But even then, the cracks were visible, in the empty shells, in the whispers, in the tired eyes of people who had been promised the future for too long. And somewhere, in a small apartment kitchen, over the sound of boiling water and radio static, someone muttered what everyone knew but few dared say aloud: "Things can't go on like this forever." By the mid-1980s, the system had begun to crack audibly. The slogans were the same, but the tone had changed. Even the people who said the words "glory to the working class" no longer sounded convinced. The air itself felt different, heavier, but also freer. Something was coming, though no one could quite name it yet. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he promised glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring. The words themselves sounded like oxygen after years of stay there. Suddenly, newspapers published articles about corruption. People could speak, at least a little more freely. Books once banned began appearing in public again. For the first time in living memory, the silence that had hung over Soviet kitchens began to lift. But the freedom came with a cost. To restructure an economy built on denial was like trying to fix an airplane mid-flight. Prices rose, stores emptied, rationing returned in Moscow and Leningrad. Lines formed before dawn, not for bread this time, but for hope. People stood waiting to see if change could fill their shelves as easily as it filled their hearts. At first, there was optimism. Western jeans and Coca-Cola appeared in special stores. Rock music blared from official stages. There were debates on television, real ones, with anger and laughter and tears, after decades of pretending. The Soviet people were finally speaking in their own voices. But the conversation quickly turned to confession about the purges, the camps, the lies. The past that had been buried came roaring back to life. For many, it was unbearable. An old veteran might sit in his armchair staring at his medals, wondering what it had all been for. A teacher who had spent her life teaching the glory of socialism now had to tell her students it was all an illusion. The ground shifted under everyone's feet, and yet there were strange joys. The first private cafes opened. Couples sat drinking imported beer under neon lights. Street artists painted graffiti on concrete walls that had once only carried party slogans. Freedom, when it finally arrived, was chaotic, a storm after 70 years of frozen weather. But not everyone could keep up. The system that had taken care of everything, job, apartment, medical care, vanished almost overnight. Pensions evaporated, wages went unpaid. The very people who had given their youth to build socialism now stood in street markets selling whatever they had left: a typewriter, a pair of shoes, a winter coat, a medal. The great Soviet sell-off had returned, only this time it wasn't a market. It was a way of life. Children of the revolution became merchants, translators, cab drivers, or simply disappeared into poverty. Factories that had run for generations went silent, their gates rusting shut. The empire had been built on command, and when the command stopped coming, everything else did too. And then, one night in December 1991, it ended. The red flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. Television showed it live. A simple act, quiet, almost tender. No one shouted. No one cheered. It was over. The country that had promised eternity had lasted 74 years. The next morning, people still went to work. The trams still ran, the bread lines still formed. But the air felt hollow, as if the century itself had exhaled. For those who lived through it, the collapse was not fireworks and freedom. It was paperwork and confusion, a new currency, a new anthem, new borders, the world outside. Called it liberation, inside, it felt more like displacement, like waking up in a new country without ever leaving your apartment. And yet, amid the wreckage, life began again. Markets opened, churches reopened. Old habits re-emerged. Laughter, barter, hustle, the same adaptability that had carried the Soviet people through famine and war now. Carried them through capitalism. But something had been lost. Not just faith in the system, but faith in the idea of a shared future. The dream that everyone was building something together, however false, had at least given meaning. Now, everyone was building for themselves. Today, the relics of that vanished world linger quietly. A cracked statue of Lenin in a provincial town square. A grandmother's ration card pressed in a family album. A yellowing photograph of a parade where everyone is smiling the same smile. These are not symbols of failure, but of endurance, for all its cruelty. The Soviet experiment produced generations who learned to survive anything. The hunger, the cold, the silence, and even freedom itself. And so the story of daily life in the Soviet Union ends not with revolution, but with something smaller and more human. A pot of de-steaming on the windowsill in a grey apartment block. A radio playing softly, and someone, maybe a grandmother, maybe a child, looking out at the snow, remembering what it was like when the future still seemed certain. If there was one thing that defined everyday Soviet life, it wasn't the red flags, or the parades, or the speeches from marble balconies. It was the queue, the endless, aching line that stretched from bakeries through department stores, and sometimes right out into the snow, and you never quite knew what you were waiting for. Could have been bread, could have been meat, might have been boots, or soap, or even toilet paper, something that had become almost mythical in its rarity. But what you could be sure of was that someone, somewhere, was listening. The KGB had ears everywhere, even in these slow, shuffling human chains. They planted informers in the longest queues, standing patiently beside exhausted workers and mothers, pretending to wait for the same loaf of bread while quietly taking notes. If anyone dared mutter a complaint about shortages, or worse, a curse against the state, those words could travel further than you'd ever expect. The queue is the pulse of the country, a place where official promises met the stubborn reality of an empty shelf. People came to understand how far the truth was from what the posters claimed. But there was another way, a hidden network that bypassed all that standing and waiting. It was Kolblatt. Blatt wasn't a word for corruption, not exactly. It was a way of life, a complex web of favors and friendships that held Soviet society together. In a place where money couldn't always get you what you needed, relationships could. A warehouse guard who owed you a favor might call when sugar came in. A store manager could save you a pair of boots under the counter. A cousin who worked in a ministry could make sure your name appeared on the right list. It was the soft machinery that kept the system running when the official gears had long since rusted over. As the old saying went, you don't need 100 rubles, you need 100 friends. Satirical magazines poked fun at it. One cartoon in crocodile showed a shopkeeper smiling proudly beneath a sign that read, "If I don't know you, I don't sell to you." It was funny, because it was true. Those without the right connections had no choice but to queue, and queue, and queue. The average Soviet woman, it said, spent round 2 hours a day in line. That adds up to 9 full working weeks a year just. Waiting sometimes for nothing. It wasn't just an inconvenience. It became part of the rhythm of life itself. People brought chairs, they brought books, they brought stories in the queue. You could live a small lifetime hope. Despair, gossip, laughter, resignation, and as millions stood in those lines. The state was busy constructing grand boulevards and marble palaces to prove that socialism was thriving. The contrast was almost surreal, cathedrals of stone celebrating a life that few could actually live. Then, in 1935, a strange new slogan appeared from Stalin himself. Life has become better. Comrades, life has become more cheerful. It was both a command and a promise, after years of famine, fear, and forced industrialization. The message was clear. It was time for the people to smile again, or at least look like they were. Historians call this moment the Great Retreat, a cultural shift that tried to replace the greyness of revolution with the brightness of controlled happiness. Suddenly, the state encouraged leisure. Parks, dances, even jazz were no longer suspect. The future wasn't only in factories, it could be in affairs. Wheel or a summer festival. And nowhere embodied this new vision more than Gorky Park, built on the site of Moscow's old municipal dump. Here, among the flower beds and roller coasters, the Soviet citizen was supposed to learn how to enjoy themselves correctly. It was part school, part carnival. There were classes on hygiene, etiquette, and urban behavior, how to hold a fork, how not to spit on the floor, how to speak properly. For the new Soviet elite, culture Kulturnost wasn't just taste. It was identity. To be cultured was to be civilized. To lack it was to be backward. One popular saying summed it up. Without that piece of paper, you are an insect. With it, a human being. The park embodied this stream of transformation. It had Ferris wheels and dance floors, cinemas, and even parachute towers during the winter opening of 1935. A massive banner stretched across the main gate. Life has become more cheerful, and in a way, it looked like it had. Foreign diplomats marveled at the sight. Thousands of young Soviets, marching, singing, skiing across asphalt streets, their faces tanned and smiling. The American ambassador called it one of the most beautiful exhibitions I have ever seen. But that was July 1937, the height of the Great Terror. While gymnasts spun in the air above the park's parades, the secret police were busy arresting those same young people's fathers, mothers, teachers, anyone unlucky enough to be accused of enemy thought. Just a few kilometers away, the Lubyanka prison was full to bursting. The screams there couldn't be heard over the music in Gorky Park. It was as if two realities coexisted, one bright, choreographed, and full of music, and another dark, hidden, and filled with fear, in a single day. A citizen could dance beneath the red banners of joy and return home to find a neighbor had vanished overnight. The park was both escape and illusion of living. Across the Soviet Union of the 1930s, something extraordinary was happening. Something that changed not just factories and cities, but the very rhythm of human life. It was a social earthquake. Everywhere, people were moving, climbing, shifting, transforming. Peasants left their wooden villages for the first time, swapping the soil of their ancestors for the smoke of factory towns. Young workers were pulled off the production lines and sent to technical schools, or into the party bureaucracy. It was so common that official forms had a special question for it. Year of moving out of production. It assumed that everyone would, that your life was meant to change. Behind this vast shuffle of humanity was a plan, and at its center, a single man, Joseph Stalin. He wanted to build a new ruling class, loyal to the system that had raised it. A generation that owed its success, its education, and even its sense of self entirely to the Soviet state. The engine of this dream was education. To study was not just ambition, it was salvation. It was the ladder out of the mud. Where or what wasn't important, one woman remembered. I just wanted to study. There was even a saying that captured it perfectly. Without that piece of paper, you are an insect. With it, a human being. For a country born out of peasantry, this was more than metaphor. It was transformation. Factories became schools. Miners became engineers. Farm boys became party. Secretaries. It was a dizzying leap forward, and the numbers tell the story. Between 1928 and 1938, the number of children in school almost tripled. Secondary enrollment multiplied 6 times over. The state created a whole new infrastructure to feed this hunger for knowledge, special worker. As faculties, called rabfecs, where laborers could learn algebra by night and politics by day. There were industrial academies, like the one that trained a young Nikita Khrushchev, who began as a mine mechanic before climbing the ranks to become the first secretary of the Communist Party. These were the institutions where the future was manufactured, not of metal, but of people. Some of these stories sound almost like fairy tales. Georgy Alexandrov, born to a poor factory worker, spent his childhood homeless, taken in by an orphanage. He trained as a metal worker, studied relentlessly, and eventually became head of propaganda for the Central Committee. Sergei Kaftanov, once a teenage miner, rose through trade schools and industrial institutes to become the deputy minister for culture. Roman Bannikov, son of a peasant, and Viktor Livanov, son of a village cooper. Each climbed from the lowest factory floor to run massive steel plants. These weren't isolated. Miracles, they were the blueprint. This entire generation, often called the Brezhnev generation, formed the backbone of Soviet leadership for the next half-century. They were men and women who had grown up believing that loyalty to the state and personal ambition could coexist. That study, hard work, and discipline could turn a farmhand into a hero of industry. But beneath that shining ladder of opportunity was a shadow. Because while education did open doors, those doors didn't always lead to freedom. Knowledge itself was still bound to ideology. Every textbook, every classroom, every diploma existed within the same message. The party knows best. Children recited it at school. Students repeated it in exams. And professors built their careers on proving it in research papers. To question was to risk. Everything. So people learned to study with precision, but also with science. Still, for millions, this promise of upward mobility was enough. It gave meaning to the endless queues, the propaganda parades, the slogans painted across the factory walls. It offered something the older world never had, the feeling that tomorrow could, somehow, be different. Behind the endless slogans, the heroic posters, and the thundering parades, there was another world. A quieter, humbler world that unfolded behind thin apartment walls and shared kitchens. It was here, inside the communalka, that Soviet life truly happened. If the streets were for socialism, the home was for survival. And it was in these cramped, overheated rooms that the new Soviet human being was tested. Not on the battlefield, not in the factory, but at the dinner table. Imagine this, 8 families to one apartment, a single kitchen, with 8 small tables lined up against the wall, each jealously defended as private territory. 8 teapots, 8 salt shakers, 8 hooks in the bathroom for 8 toilet seats, because even privacy had to be portable. Children ran through the hallways, dodging drying laundry and old coats. Someone was always boiling cabbage. Someone was always shouting. Someone was always crying, and yet, amid the constant friction, a kind of strange intimacy formed. Neighbors might feud over whose turn it was to clean the sink, But they also helped nurse each other through illness, lent each other bread, and sometimes even hid one another from the secret police. The communal apartment was both battlefield and safety net, a miniature version of the Soviet Union itself. To live there was to learn a special choreography. You moved through the corridor without brushing shoulders, without glancing too long, without saying more than necessary. Even the silence had etiquette. Writer Joseph Brodsky once called it a domestic penal colony. But even he admitted there was something miraculous about how life persisted in those tight spaces. Laughter, music, the smell of stew. A sense of entrance so strong it became its own kind of culture. By the late 1980s, almost a quarter of Leningrad still lived this way. Entire generations raised within earshot of every argument, every lullaby, every whispered joke about the government. They were people trained, almost from birth, in patience, and if the communalka taught them how to live in tight spaces, the Q taught them how to live in time itself. In the Soviet Union, waiting wasn't just a nuisance. It was a way of life, a quiet ritual that shaped entire days, years, and personalities. The Q orchard was more than a line. It was an ecosystem, a place where the promise of communism collided with the reality of scarcity. If you saw a line forming, you didn't ask what it was for. You just got in. Only once you were safely inside it would you dare ask, what are they giving out? Bread, soap, a pair of check shoes, whatever it was probably deficit. The great Soviet word for anything desirable and impossible to find. People carried of Oscars. String bags, folded in pockets just in case. Because in the Soviet Union, the unexpected sight of abundance could appear anywhere and vanish just as quickly. Some lines lasted hours, others days. A woman might spend 2 hours each morning queuing, nearly 9 weeks a year just standing, hoping something would be left when her turn came. And yet, the queue was not just about deprivation. It was also about community. People traded stories, gossip, recipes, and rumors. It became the nation's unofficial public square, a place where truths slipped out that could never be spoken elsewhere. The authorities knew this. They sent informers to stand quietly in the longer lines, listening for muttered curses against the party or jokes about the leader. Even so, the queue endured, a symbol of entrance itself. 1,000 tiny acts of patience, each one a small protest against the system that had promised plenty. But where the line failed, another force took over, an invisible economy that thrived in the shadows. It was called Blatt. If there was one skill that truly mattered in the Soviet Union, it wasn't Marxist theory, or even hard work. It was Blatt. Blatt wasn't corruption in the Western sense. It was the glue that held the whole broken system together. When the official economy failed, this invisible network of favors quietly stepped in to keep people fed, clothed, and sane. The saying went, "It's not what you know, it's who you know," or, more Sovietly, "Don't have 100 rubles, have 100 friends. That friend could be anyone, the warehouse clerk who let you know when a shipment of sausage arrived, the store manager who saved a pair of imported shoes just in case, or the nurse who whispered that tomorrow's hospital line might move faster if you brought flowers." Money had little power, but a favor. That was real currency. People built entire social lives round it. A teacher might trade extra tutoring for sugar. A driver might lose a bit of state fuel to help a friend move furniture. A butcher might quietly slip an extra cut of meat under the counter in exchange for theater tickets. Blatt wasn't written down, but everyone understood its rules. You gave when you could. You called when you needed. You never forgot a favor. The system was so vast and so accepted that even satire magazines joked about it openly. One cartoon in Crocodile showed a grocery manager at the counter saying, "If I don't know you, I can't sell to you. For those with the right connections, shortages were survivable. For those without, there was only the queue." Sociologists later described Blatt as the second economy. Unofficial, yet absolutely essential. A parallel world where personal trust replaced market prices and morality blurred with necessity. This was how a society that officially outlawed private exchange ended up depending on it. Completely, a system that preached equality turned survival into an art form of privilege. But while Blatt smoothed some lives, it also hardened others. Those without connections learned another kind of virtue, endurance and endurance, more than anything, defined the Soviet spirit. Still, amid the struggle, people dreamed of something better, not just food and comfort, but beauty. The regime had promised paradise, and for all its failure to provide material plenty, it was determined to deliver paradise in another form, architecture. Because if you couldn't have a better life, you could at least live surrounded by symbols of one. Walk through any Soviet city, Moscow, Kiev, Minsk, or Novosibirsk, and you can feel the ideology in the bricks. The buildings don't just stand, they announce. They declare, "We are building the future." The Soviet Union didn't just build homes or offices. It built monuments to purpose. Every block, every curve, every concrete slab had a story to tell. In the early decades, architecture was bold, utopian, the spirit of revolution translated into stone. The 1920s saw experiments with constructivism, sharp, geometric, and efficient. Designed for a collective society, buildings looked like machines for a living, honest. Stripped of decoration, functional to the bone, but by the 1930s, under Stalin. A different vision took hold. Constructivism was too cold, too alienating. Now came the Stalinist empire style. Tall, grand, dripping with columns and ornaments, Moscow became the heart of the stream. The skyline was reshaped with the Seven Sisters, colossal skyscrapers that looked like Gothic. Cathedrals fused with rockets. They were built not just to impress citizens, but to intimidate the West. Inside, the marble floors gleamed, chandeliers sparkled like stars, murals depicted workers, farmers, and cosmonauts, all smiling in eternal harmony. Even subway stations were transformed into palaces, the Moscow metro a literal underground. Gallery offered marble pillars, bronze statues, and mosaics of the radiant future. Commuters might wait an hour for bread, but on their way, they could stand beneath chandeliers that would make a czar blush. The idea was simple but powerful. If life couldn't be luxurious, at least it could look luxurious. If people couldn't feel equal in comfort, they could at least feel equal in grandeur. Then came the Khrushchev years, and with them, a hard reality check. Luxury was out, efficiency was in. The post-war baby boom had flooded cities with people desperate for housing. Enter the Khrushchevka, 5-story apartment blocks, built fast and cheap, where millions would spend their lives. Tiny rooms, thin walls, shared kitchens, but to those who had known barracks or shared communal flats, they were a miracle. For the first time, families had private bathrooms, balconies, and the faintest whisper of privacy. Khrushchev promised to end the housing shortage in 10 years, of course. He didn't, but the effort gave millions a home to call their own. These grey rectangles might look dull today, but to the people who moved in, they were symbols of dignity. You could hang your own curtains, cook your own meals, even close your door and be alone. A small revolution within the larger one. Outside, the neighborhoods were lined with birch trees. playgrounds, and statues of Lenin smiling down from their pedestals. Each city became a kind of living museum, a mixture of grandeur, efficiency, and quiet melancholy. In summer, kids played on cracked concrete courts. In winter, mothers dragged sleds down icy paths between blocks, and above it all, the slogans, "Glory to labor," "Forward to communism." But architecture was more than propaganda. It shaped how people felt. The grand boulevards and concrete jungles created a strange duality, a sense of collective belonging mixed with personal smallness. You are part of something monumental and yet utterly insignificant. Still, there was beauty in it. The way light hit the gold domes at sunset, the echo of footsteps in an empty metro corridor, the smell of wet concrete after rain. The Soviet Union was built to impress eternity, and in a way, it succeeded. Even today, long after the ideology crumbled, the cities remained like ghosts of a dream that refused to fade, and inside those grey walls, life continued. People fell in love, raised children, celebrated birthdays, and mourned quietly behind the curtains. Behind the grey concrete walls and political posters, life in the Soviet Union was full of small rebellions of joy, moments that didn't make it into official reports, but kept people human. You see, for all the slogans about the new Soviet man, people were still people. They wanted to laugh, to dance, to love, to forget. So they found happiness quietly. In the evenings, after a long day of queuing and working, families gathered round the radio, the hum of static, the familiar announcer's voice, and then the soft crackle of a favorite song. Sometimes it was an official Soviet ballad about tractors or harvests. Sometimes it was something smuggled in, a Western melody drifting in from the forbidden frequencies of Voice of America or Radio Luxembourg. Those who tuned in knew they were breaking the rules. But what was life without a little risk? Teenagers secretly listened to the Beatles on reel-to-reel tapes copied dozens of times. They called it, magnetized it. Homemade recordings passed like contraband, each generation a little fuzzier, but no less magical. Even more daring were the ribs, when vinyl was scarce. People pressed records onto discarded X-ray films. You could literally listen to forbidden music, carved onto an image of someone's broken leg or chest cavity. They called it music on the bones, and it played beautifully. At home, life revolved around small comforts. The kitchen was the heart of every Soviet apartment, not just for cooking, but for truth. It was the one place where people could speak freely, behind closed doors, over steaming cups of tea and a shared cigarette. There, in the low light and the smell of cabbage soup, real opinions came out. Someone might lower their voice and say, "Did you hear? Bread prices are going up again." Someone else would answer, "Don't say that too loud. The walls have ears," and yet laughter followed. Because what else could you do but laugh? There were family rituals, collecting mushrooms in the forest, summer trips to the dacha, long train rides to the Black Sea. For many, the dacha, that tiny wooden cottage with a garden, was paradise. There, surrounded by birch trees and buzzing mosquitoes, you could plant tomatoes, sing songs with neighbors, and for a few days pretend you were free. In winter, joy took on a different form. Children sledded down snowy hills on wooden boards. Adults queued for oranges, a rare luxury. To make the New Year's table complete, television would play Irony of Fate, the beloved romantic comedy about a drunk man who ends up in the wrong apartment, yet somehow finds love. It was more than a movie. It was a mirror, gently mocking the sameness of Soviet life, while celebrating its humanity. Every New Year, millions tuned in, laughing and crying together across 11 time zones. Work, too, wasn't always grim. Factories and offices often had subotics. Voluntary Saturdays for cleaning or community projects, followed by drinking and singing. Even under state eyes, friendships blossomed. Birthdays were celebrated with vodka, pickled cucumbers, and someone inevitably pulling out an accordion. Then came the toasts to comradeship, to love, to survival, and sometimes, quietly, to freedom. Someday, happiness wasn't given. It was made. It lived in those stolen smiles, in the warmth of shared misery, in the music hummed under one's breath on a crowded tram. Even the most loyal party member had a secret pleasure, a banned novel, a hidden bottle, or a photograph of a Western car clipped from a magazine. Dreams were private currency. There is a strange beauty in that kind of joy, the kind that insists on existing even when it shouldn't. It wasn't loud. It wasn't revolutionary. It was quiet, patient, enduring. Because to be happy in the Soviet Union wasn't about having everything. It was about making something out of nothing, and still finding a reason to smile, and through those smiles, something deeper survived. The soul of a people too stubborn to give up their humanity. For all its ambition to build a new kind of human being, the Soviet state could never fully erase the oldest force in human history. Belief. Not the belief in Marx or Lenin, but the quiet, personal kind. The kind that doesn't need approval, or permission, or even words. When the Bolsheviks took power, they declared war on religion. Churches were closed or turned into warehouses, barns, and museums of atheism. Priests were arrested, icons confiscated, bells melted down for bullets. The old world of saints and miracles was to be replaced by science, reason, and socialism. But faith is stubborn, and in the cracks of Soviet life, it survived. In the countryside, old women still crossed themselves when passing a church ruin. Babushkas whispered the Lord's Prayer in kitchens with the curtains drawn. They hid icons behind embroidered towels, sometimes even behind portraits of Lenin himself. Children grew up knowing never to speak of what grandma did on Sundays. They learned early that belief was private, sacred not because it was divine, but because it was forbidden. There were atheist lectures at factories and universities. Yes, posters showed priests as greedy parasites, fat and lazy, clutching money bags. But those same students, years later, would quietly baptize their own children, not out of rebellion, but because it felt right in the Soviet Union. Even superstition had politics. Horoscopes were banned. Palm reading was frowned upon. But workers still slipped lucky coins into their boots before exams. Pilots kept small charms in their cockpits. Miners refused to whistle underground. Everyone knew it summoned bad spirits. The official line was, religion is the opium of the people. But in reality, the people never quit their opium. They just took it quietly. In remote regions like Siberia and Central Asia, traditional faiths, Orthodox Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, adapted to survive. Imams held secret Friday prayers in monks. Monks kept prayer books hidden under floorboards. Buddhist lamas memorized sacred texts that if the police raided their monastery, the knowledge wouldn't die with the confiscated books. And in cities, another kind of belief was rising. Not in God, but in fate, destiny, and the unseen. Astrologers, psychics, and healers, all banned, were in constant demand. People lined up to see fortune tellers in back alleys, women who read tea leaves or felt the pulse of fate in your wrist. Even party officials went in secret, seeking comfort that no ideology could provide. The paradox was glaring. A society that worshipped reason was full of whispers about destiny. A government that promised to control everything was haunted by the things it couldn't. By the 1970s, this quiet spirituality found strange new forms. Yoga classes disguised as physical education. Groups, mystical books copied and passed down on typewriters. And people, sitting cross-legged in their kitchens, meditating under the sound of dripping taps. Some called it the hunger of the soul. Others said it was just another way to survive. Because under all the propaganda and the fear, people still longed for meaning, something bigger than the slogans, the plans, the endless 5-year targets. They wanted to believe that suffering wasn't just random, that maybe, somehow, life had purpose. And when the system finally began to crumble, it wasn't tanks or protests that broke it first. It was something quieter, a generation that had learned to doubt, to hope, to pray, even if they didn't call it prayer. When churches reopened in the late 1980s, old women who had never stopped believing wept openly in the streets. Young people, who had been told all their lives that God was a myth, lit candles anyway. And the bells that had been melted for bullets began to ring again, the same sound that had echoed through Russia for 1,000 years. Faith, fear, superstition, they had never left. They had just waited. And when the Iron Curtain began to crack, they rushed back in like sunlight into a dark, sealed room. Because in the end, no empire, not even the Soviet one, could command the human spirit. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union looked powerful on paper. A vast military machine, nuclear weapons, Olympic champions, and an image of unity that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific. But behind that grand illusion, daily life was quietly disintegrating. People didn't wake up one morning and realize the system had failed. It happened like rust, slow, silent, eating everything from the inside. The queues were longer than ever, the shops emptier, the jokes darker, the hope thinner. By this point, most Soviet citizens had stopped believing in the future. They believed in getting through the day. That was victory enough. In the early 1980s, if you wanted toilet paper in Moscow, you had to know someone who worked at the paper factory. If you wanted sausage, you needed a friend at the food distribution office. If you wanted happiness, well, that was harder. The Soviet citizen had mastered survival through silence. You smiled at work, nodded at meetings, pretended to care. And at home, you whispered the truth in your kitchen, over tea, over vodka, under the buzz of the light bulb. Those kitchens became sacred spaces, little islands of honesty in a sea of lies. There was even a term for it, kitchen culture, the place where people finally said what they actually thought, about the party, about the shortages, about how none of it made sense anymore. It was rebellion through conversation, small, quiet, but dangerous all the same. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he promised change. Perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost openness. For a moment, it felt like the country was waking up after a long, grey sleep. Newspapers started publishing things that had been forbidden for decades. Stories about Stalins, purges, about famine, about corruption. People were shocked, even terrified. It was like realizing your own parents had been lying to you your whole life. And worse, that maybe you had been lying to yourself, too. But once the truth started coming out, it couldn't be stopped. Old taboos crumbled. Censorship loosened. And suddenly, Soviet citizens began to see the cracks in everything. The great myth that the Soviet Union was eternal began to dissolve. Economically, The country was collapsing under its own weight. Factories still ran, but they produced things nobody wanted. Trains ran late. Power grids failed. Workers showed up drunk or not at all. Money existed, but there was nothing to buy. You could have a wallet full of rubles and still starve. People joked, they pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work. It wasn't just a joke. It was the truth. For many, the final betrayal wasn't political. It was emotional. The state had promised purpose, to make you part of something vast and meaningful. But by the 1980s, that meaning was gone. Teachers taught by rote, students memorized by habit, workers clocked in. Clocked out, everyone went through the motions, keeping the machine running simply because no one knew what else to do. And then, in 1986, came Chernobyl. The explosion at the nuclear reactor in Ukraine tore a hole in the illusion of control for days. The government stayed silent while radioactive clouds drifted over Europe. Citizens went to May. They prayed, smiling and waving under invisible poison, the trust between people and the state already fragile, shattered completely. The Soviet system had always claimed to protect its people. Chernobyl proved it couldn't even tell them the truth. After that, everything felt different. The fear of the secret police faded. Because when your own government poisons you with silence, what's left to fear? By the end of the decade, the empire was unraveling in real time. Protests broke out in the Baltic states. Republics began to demand independence. The once mighty Red Army watched helplessly as the very country it defended began to dissolve beneath its boots. In December 1991, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist, but for millions. It had died long before the paperwork caught up. The day after, life looked the same. Grey streets, broken elevators, empty stores, but something was missing. The idea that all this suffering meant something. Now, there was only confusion and freedom. Two sides of the same coin. For some, it was liberation. For others, it was loss. The system that had crushed them had also defined them. It had given them purpose, jobs, pride, and in its own twisted way, belonging. Without it, they didn't know who they were. One Moscow worker put it simply, "We lost the future." But perhaps that is the real story of the Soviet Union. Not just its rise and fall, but the lives that filled the space in between. Ordinary people, born into a dream they didn't choose, struggling to stay human inside a machine. They laughed, they loved, they endured. And when the machine finally broke, they were still standing. Scarred, yes, but alive. Because in the end, history doesn't belong to systems or slogans. It belongs to the people who live through them. When the Soviet Union finally disappeared from the map in December of 1991, it didn't really vanish. Not from memory, not from habit, and certainly not from the hearts of those who'd lived their entire lives inside its strange grey rhythm. You could erase a flag overnight. You could rename cities, rewrite textbooks, replace anthems. But you couldn't erase the smell of boiled cabbage in every hallway, or the sound of a neighbor's radio leaking through paper-thin walls, or the reflexive fear of knocking too loudly on the wrong door. The USSR was gone, but it still lived on, quietly, inside people. For many, the first years after collapse felt like waking up from a very long dream. The world had changed, suddenly, brutally, and without instruction. The old rules were gone, but no one had written new ones yet. Shops filled with goods, but at prices no one could afford. Private business exploded, but so did crime. Those who spent their lives following orders now had to improvise in a capitalist jungle that rewarded risk, greed, and luck instead of obedience and patience. It was as if the entire population had been told to swim, after decades of being forbidden from touching the water. For the younger generation, the 1990s were chaos, wild, dangerous, electric. For the older generation, they were tragedy. Pensioners who'd once been respected engineers now sold their medals and tools. At flea markets, teachers and doctors took second jobs driving taxis or selling cigarettes just to buy bread. People who'd believed in a system, who'd given their youth, their loyalty, and often their silence, watched it all collapse into nothing. They felt humiliated, not just by poverty, but by the sense that their entire lives had been declared meaningless. And yet, amid that collapse, something beautiful survived. Community, even when the state vanished. Neighbors still shared food, helped each other, and traded favors, just like before. The habit of collective survival, born out of decades of shortages, became a kind of lifeline in the ruins of ideology. Simple human kindness took over. They had been trained to build utopia. And when that failed, they built something smaller and far more real: mutual care. By the 2000s, nostalgia began to creep in. Not for the terror or the queues, but for the certainty. For the predictability of life, even if it was dull and grey. For the feeling of belonging to something, anything, larger than oneself. Some called it Soviet nostalgia. Others simply called it remembering. Old songs were played on the radio again. Old flags reappeared at parades, and suddenly, the Soviet era became not just history, but myth, a story about when things were simple, when we were all together, when life had meaning, of course. Memory is selective. People forget the shortages, the censorship, the fear. They remember the summer picnics, the youth parades, the laughter in communal kitchens. Because that is what human beings do. We rewrite our pain into stories we can live with. Today, more than 3 decades later, the Soviet Union still haunts the present, in the architecture, the institutions, and the psychology of the people who inherited it. The apartment blocks still stand. The old slogans still echo in speeches. The past refuses to die, because millions of lives were built inside it. The historian Yuri Levoda once said, "The Soviet man did not disappear. He simply adapted." And maybe that's the truest legacy of all, the extraordinary human ability to adapt. To survive any system, any ideology, any disaster, and still find small reasons to smile. So what was daily life really like in the Soviet Union? It was waiting. It was hoping. It was pretending. It was surviving. It was millions of people trying to live decent lives inside an indecent system, dreaming of a better tomorrow. Even when tomorrow never came, and when the walls finally fell, they didn't crumble into nothing. They broke apart into memories, painful, beautiful, ordinary, the kind that still hum quietly behind closed doors in old photo albums, in the way someone still boils tea before long conversation. Because in the end, history isn't just written in revolutions or decrees. It is written in the quiet persistence of daily life, in the endurance of those who lived through it. And the people of the Soviet Union, for all their suffering, lived, they endured, they dreamed, they kept going. The cold in Kolyma wasn't just weather. It was a presence, a thinking, breathing entity that sat over the camps like an emperor on a throne of frost. It silenced arguments, slowed movement, and erased any idea of rebellion. Men didn't fight the cold, they obeyed it. When a prisoner's fingers stopped working, He didn't curse or shout. He just stared, as if his hands had betrayed him. The first stage of frostbite was pale white, then purple, then black. Most didn't feel pain until it was far too late. The body gave up quietly, long before the mind understood what was happening. Shalamov wrote that the greatest privilege in Colomar was warmth. A pair of felt boots could make you a king. A bit of firewood, real wood, not frozen sawdust, could save a dozen lives. The gods knew this. Warmth was currency, and they rationed it like gold. Even the act of breathing hurt. The air sliced through the lungs like glass splinters. Prisoners learned to inhale through scarves, to keep a thin layer of warmth between themselves and the world that wanted them dead. When someone died in the snow, their body froze in place within hours. Sometimes the living used them as windbreaks. At night, the barracks echoed with a strange chorus, coughing, teeth chattering, the creak of frozen wood, and the low murmur of men talking to themselves, dreams of soup, of bread, of warm baths that no longer existed. The Soviet state didn't design Colomar as a place of death, at least not on paper, officially. It was a site of labor heroism. Posters in Moscow showed happy miners smiling in fur hats, holding golden nuggets under a bright red sun. The reality was far colder and quieter every day. The guards shouted the same phrase, "Na robotu," to work. It didn't matter if your boots were frozen or your coat soaked in ice. It didn't matter if you hadn't eaten in 2 days. The quotas had to be met. The gold had to flow. And if you didn't move fast enough, someone else would take your place in the line. In the 1930s and 40s, tens of thousands died here every year. The bodies were buried in shallow pits, or sometimes just left where they fell. Spring thaw would bring them back, bones rising through the melting ice, like pale reminders of the price of progress. Yet, somehow, the human mind still found ways to adapt. Prisoners whispered poems. They traded jokes in the dark. A scrap of newspaper became treasure. Something to read, to hold, to prove that the outside world still existed. There were moments, fleeting, fragile moments, when survival felt almost like victory. A stolen piece of bread, a hot cup of water, a song hummed beneath one's breath. Even in Colomar, the idea of humanity refused to die. Shalamov once said that Colomar didn't make better people. It only revealed who people really were. It stripped away everything else: ideology, faith, education, pride. What was left was something raw and terrible, but still, somehow, alive. When spring finally came to Colomar, it wasn't a celebration. It was a slow thawing of horrors. The snow began to melt, and the landscape came alive with what the ice had hidden: boots, bones, fragments of clothing. The rivers swelled with the runoff from the mountains, carrying traces of ash and gold dust downstream. The cold retreated, but it left behind silence, the kind of silence only a place of suffering can know. By the late 1940s, Colomar had become both myth and machine. In Moscow, it was spoken of encoded language, a land of heroic labor, of men mining for the glory of socialism. But in whispered conversations, it was a place you might disappear to and never return from. Each transport that arrived brought fresh faces: engineers, soldiers, poets, even musicians, people who had said the wrong thing or trusted the wrong friend, sometimes. No one even knew why they were there. A missing signature could condemn you. A rumor could freeze your future. And still, the work went on. The rhythm of Colomar was mechanical. Wake before dawn, march in silence, dig, haul, collapse, sleep. Repeat. The guards were not devils. Most were victims too, trapped in a system that demanded cruelty as routine. They lived beside the prisoners, in the same cold, under the same indifferent stars. Food was the dividing line between life and death. A bowl of watery soup could mean another day. Hunger wasn't a feeling anymore. It was a rhythm that shaped everything. How you walked, how you thought, how you dreamed. One prisoner remembered dreaming of bread so vividly that when he woke up, he could still taste it. And yet, amid this frozen hell, strange bonds formed. A shared glance when a guard turned away. A piece of stolen sugar split in half. A whispered verse from Pushkin under the breath. Words that reminded men they were still human. Those small acts of defiance, invisible to history, were the true resistance. When news of Stalin's death reached Kolyma in March 1953, no one believed it at first. The loudspeakers blared with somber music. Guards stood stiff, pale-faced and sure what to do. Some prisoners cried. Others laughed quietly into their sleeves, afraid to be seen. The regime that had built Kolyma was cracking. But the ice didn't melt overnight. It took years for the gates to open, for the survivors to stagger back into the world. Many found there was no home waiting for them. Families gone, jobs taken, cities changed. They had survived, but they were no longer the same species of human as those who had never been there. The Soviet Union tried to forget Kolyma. It erased the names, sealed the archives, paved over the camps. But the ground never forgot. Even today, when the permafrost shifts, bones still surface, pale fragments of a history that refuse to stay buried. In that way, Kolyma never truly ended. It lingers in the Russian imagination like a chill that seeps into the bones. Not the kind that kills, but the kind that never leaves, because in the Soviet Union, cold was not just a temperature. It was a way of life. When Joseph Stalin died in March of 1953, the air across the Soviet Union seemed to change. Not just politically, physically. It was as though an invisible frost began to melt. People walked differently, spoke differently. Even the official photographs softened, for the first time in decades. Silence didn't feel mandatory. At first, no one knew what to believe. There had been so many deaths, so many speeches, so many sudden disappearances that the news of Stalin's death felt like another rumor. The factories still ran, the sirens still howled, and the portraits of the Generalissimo still hung on every school wall, but somewhere inside, an old fear began to thaw when Nikita Khrushchev rose to power. The country exhaled, slowly, cautiously. And then came February 1956, the moment that split Soviet history in two. Khrushchev stood before a closed session of the 20th Party Congress and delivered his secret speech. He denounced the man who had been treated like a god. He described Stalin's crimes, the purges, the executions, the mass terror, not as the acts of enemies, but of their own leader. For many who heard it, the words landed like an earthquake. Some fainted, some wept, others refused to believe. The man whose portrait had hung in every classroom, whose name was written in every song, had become a monster in a single speech. And yet, the speech itself was never printed in full. It spread like a rumor, whispered from ear to ear, copied by hand, read in secret. That was how truth returned to the Soviet Union, not as thunder, but as a whisper. The years that followed became known simply as the thaw, a cultural springtime. Prisoners returned from the camps, thin, quiet, blinking into the sunlight. Families that had long assumed their loved ones were dead were stunned when someone knocked on the door. There were awkward reunions, too. children who no longer recognized their parents, wives who had remarried, survivors who found they no longer fit into the world they'd returned to. For the first time, Soviet citizens began to ask forbidden questions, not only what happened, but why. Writers and filmmakers tested the limits of what could be said. In 1959, Mikhail Kalatozov's The Cranes Are Flying on the Pondy or at Cannes, a Soviet film about love and loss during the war, where the state was not the hero. That had never happened before. Magazines published poetry that hinted at the unspoken. School children read Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, the first work ever printed in the Soviet Union to describe life in a labor camp. It was raw and simple and real. For a brief, trembling moment, truth felt possible. Life, too, began to look different. The post-war reconstruction was nearly complete. The Soviet Union was urbanizing fast. Millions moved into new apartments, small and identical, but private. Families who had shared a single room for years now had their own kitchens, their own bathrooms, even balconies with flowers. It was called the Khrushchevka Revolution. 5-story concrete blocks that remade Soviet life. Inside, the air was full of novelty. Television sets, radios, pressure cookers, bookshelves, and dreams. The walls were thin, the plumbing unreliable. But for millions, this was luxury. For the first time, there was space for laughter, for rest. For music in the evenings, children watched American cartoons on state TV. Young people danced too. Jazz records brought back by sailors from Odessa. The state frowned, of course, but it tolerated more than it used to. Even the face of the future changed. The Soviet Union began to look outward, not to conquer, but to compete. In 1957, the world gasped as Sputnik 1 crossed the sky, a tiny silver sphere that made the West tremble. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin, the smiling, boyish son of a carpenter, became the first human to leave the planet. "I see no God up here," he supposedly said, and for a brief moment, it felt like the Soviet dream had broken through gravity itself for a generation that had grown up under Stalin's shadow. Gagarin's flight was proof that the future was real, and that it could be beautiful, and yet, even as the thaw opened hearts, the ice never truly disappeared. Certain books remained banned. Certain jokes could still cost you your career. And though the camps had emptied, the idea of obedience still ruled the air. The Soviet Union was learning to breathe again, but it was still afraid to shout. The great paradox of the thaw was this: people rediscovered their humanity, but not their freedom, and that an easy balance between progress and control, between joy and fear, would define the next decades of Soviet life. By the late 1960s, the Soviet Union was no longer a place of terror or thaw. It was something else entirely. Calm, predictable, and for many, quietly suffocating. When Leonid Brezhnev took the reins in 1964, he promised stability, and delivered it, in every sense of the word. Gone were the days of purges and panic. The chaos of reform gave way to routine. Life under Brezhnev was, for most citizens, safer than ever before, but it was also slower. This was the era of stagnation. Though no one called it that yet, factories hummed, fields were planted. The space program continued, and Moscow looked more modern than ever. On the surface, everything seemed fine, almost prosperous. The shelves weren't overflowing. But they weren't empty either. People had jobs, apartments, and a sense of normalcy that their parents could only have dreamed of. But underneath, the energy that had once propelled the Soviet project began to fade. The slogans still echoed: forward to communism. But few believed them anymore. The dream had turned into habit. People worked. Not because they believed, but because that's what one did. Still, the average Soviet life during this period wasn't terrible. It was steady. The morning commute to the factory or office was a ritual. Crowded buses and rattling trams carried millions through cities wrapped in the scent of diesel and damp wool. In every workplace, portraits of Lenin and Brezhnev hung side by side. Watching as typewriters clacked and coffee cups clinked. The Soviet workday was often a mixture of diligence and delay, bursts of genuine effort punctuated by long pauses, endless meetings, and quiet resignation. Many workers joked that they pretended to work, and the state pretended to pay them. But after work, that's where Soviet life came alive. Evenings were for family, television, and companionship. Apartment blocks echoed with laughter, footsteps, and the rhythmic tapping of dominoes on kitchen tables. The state might have controlled speech, but it couldn't control friendship, and every household had its own small rituals mothers made. Tea with jam. Fathers tinkered with radios or fixed leaky pipes. Children watched cartoons like no Pagodi, the Soviet answer to Tom and Jerry. And on Saturdays, the smell of homemade vodka drifted through stairwells as neighbors gathered to toast birthdays, promotions, or just survival. Television became the new hearth. Shows like 17 Moments of Spring, a spy drama about a Soviet agent in Nazi Germany, drew millions. The news programs, full of official optimism, spoke of record harvests and brotherly solidarity. And on New Year's Eve, the entire nation watched the president's speech before midnight, then clinked glasses as the Kremlin clock struck 12. It was a time when public life and private life drifted apart. In public, one repeated the official line. In private, one joked, gossiped, and dreamed. The kitchen became the true parliament of the Soviet people, a small, smoky refuge where truth was spoken softly over tea and vodka. Of course, there were shortages, always. The joke went that the Soviet Union could produce intercontinental missiles, but not decent sausages. Long queues snaked outside stores for meat, sugar, or toilet paper. When oranges appeared before New Year's, it was a miracle. People hoarded, bartered, and traded through a vast shadow economy known as the Blatt, a network of favors that made life livable. Need a refrigerator, a car part, a better doctor. You didn't look for it in a store. You found someone who knew someone. Despite all the inefficiency, life carried a strange coziness, a sense of shared experience. Everyone was in the same boat, and for many, that sameness was oddly comforting, culturally. The Soviet Union was at its most stable and most numb. Books, plays, and songs had to pass through censors. The bold experimentation of the Khrushchev years gave way to conformity. Yet even within those limits, creativity found cracks. Poets like Yevtushenko and singers like Vladimir Vysotsky captured the ache of an entire generation, men and women who had everything they were promised, except the feeling that it mattered. Abroad, the USSR projected strength. Domestically, it projected calm, but internally, it was quietly decaying. Like an old apartment with good wallpaper and bad plumbing, technology lagged behind the West. Corruption flourished in silence. And the younger generation, born after the war, raised on space heroes and party slogans, began to notice the gap between words and reality. They listened to Western rock on smuggled tapes. They wore blue jeans, a symbol of defiance wrapped in denim. They watched Olympic broadcasts from abroad and saw a different kind of life, freer, brighter, somehow more real. By the late 1970s, the Soviet Union had grown tired of pretending. The official slogans still thundered, but no one listened. The parades went on, but the cheers were hollow. Behind the facade of stability, the system was quietly running out of fuel, and yet, if you asked most people at the time, they'd say life was fine. Not great, not terrible, just fine. It was the Soviet paradox. The dream of revolution had ended not with violence, but with a yawn. Still, the story wasn't over, because as the 1980s dawned, a new generation of Soviet citizens, restless, skeptical, and quietly bold, began to wonder whether fine was enough, and soon cracks would start to show in the frozen surface of Soviet certainty. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union looked solid, immovable, even eternal. The red flag still flew over the Kremlin, the May Day parades still thundered down Red Square, and the portraits of aging leaders still smiled from every wall. But beneath the surface, the system was rotting quietly. The economy had stalled. Factories churned out low-quality goods no one wanted. Collective farms produced less each year despite endless 5-year plans, and people had grown numb. Not rebellious, just tired. Then, one after another, the old men at the top began to die. Brezhnev in 1982, Andropov in 1984, Chernenko in 1985. It became a dark Soviet joke. They pretend to lead us, and we pretend they're alive. Then came Mikhail Gorbachev, young, confident, and astonishingly different. He was only 54, with quick speech, sharp eyes, and a bold idea that the system could be saved. If only it could be changed. His slogans were new words that would soon define an era. Perestroika, restructuring, glasnost, openness. At first, they sounded harmless, like bureaucratic jargon, but in practice, they cracked open a closed world for the first time in decades. People could say things in public that had once been whispered only in kitchens. Newspapers began to print stories about corruption, environmental disasters, and even the crimes of Stalin. Old banned books reappeared on shelves. Solzhenitsyn, Pasternak, Bulgakov. The silence that had hung over the Soviet Union for generations began to lift. At first, it felt exhilarating. The air itself seemed fresher. Students filled lecture halls debating politics. Workers began to speak openly in meetings. Television showed programs about poverty, pollution, and war, things that had long been buried under propaganda. But freedom is unpredictable. As people started to speak, they realized how deep the problems went, and how little the state could actually fix. The planned economy, held together for decades by habit and fear, began to unravel when exposed to light. Shops emptied, prices soared, lines grew longer than ever. In Moscow, pensioners clutched ration cards and stood for hours hoping for bread or soap. In the Baltic republics, protests began calling for independence. And in cities across the vast country, people gathered in public squares to argue, chant, and hope. The old Soviet rituals, the slogans, the parades, the speeches, suddenly felt absurd. The red banners that once inspired pride now looked like props from another time. Still, many believed Gorbachev was sincere. He wasn't trying to destroy socialism. He was trying to save it. He spoke of a new thinking, a humane socialism, one that could exist without lies or fear. But history rarely grants such gentle transitions. By 1989, everything began to accelerate. The Berlin Wall fell. Eastern Europe's communist governments collapsed one after another. Soviet troops watched helplessly as the empire their grandfathers had fought to build disintegrated on television. At home, the Soviet Union itself began to fracture. Republics from the Baltics to the Caucasus demanded independence. National flags reappeared. Old languages, songs, and memories resurfaced. The empire that had stretched from the Carpathians to the Pacific was crumbling, not from invasion, but from within. In 1990, lines for food grew endless. Shelves stood empty even in Moscow. Bartering replaced money. People traded cigarettes for sugar, books for soap, vodka for meat. The Soviet ruble, once a symbol of stability, became nearly worthless. It was a strange time, both terrifying and electric. One could turn on the TV and see long silence, dissidents debating generals, priests, and poets in front of a live audience. Censors gave up. For the first time in 70 years, the truth was legal. And yet, amid all the hope and freedom, there was a sense of loss. The Soviet Union had been many things: cruel, absurd, heroic, bureaucratic. But for hundreds of millions, it had also been home. A shared myth, a familiar rhythm of life. And now that myth was collapsing into confusion. Old people feared what was coming. Young people rushed to embrace it. For every new cafe opening in Moscow, a factory somewhere else went dark. For every song of freedom, a pensioner somewhere went hungry. By 1991, the state was on life support. Gorbachev tried to hold it together with reforms, promises, and compromise, but the forces he had unleashed were unstoppable that August. Hardline communists attempted a coup to restore order. Tanks rolled into Moscow, but the people, ordinary citizens, students, workers, stood in the streets to block them. It was a moment of defiance and a moment of ending. By December 1991, the red flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union, a nation born in revolution, baptized in terror, and aged in stagnation, ceased to exist. In its place were 15 new countries, each struggling to find a future from the fragments of a fallen empire. And for those who had lived their whole lives under that flag, it was like waking up in a different world, free, uncertain, and strangely silent. The dream that had begun with Lenin and the storming of the Winter Palace ended not with a gunshot, but with a broadcast, a quiet television announcement that the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics W. As no more. For some, it was liberation. For others, heartbreak. For all, it was the end of an era that had shaped the 20th century. When the Soviet Union finally dissolved in December 1991, there was no great battle, no fiery last stand. Just the quiet flicker of a red flag being lowered over the Kremlin, the empire that once terrified the West and shaped half the planet's politics vanished almost overnight. For those who lived through it, the collapse wasn't dramatic, it was confusing. One day they were Soviet citizens, and the next they weren't. Their passports were suddenly invalid. Their money lost its value. Their history, the story they'd been told about who they were and why their sacrifices mattered, no longer applied. It was, in many ways, a spiritual crisis as much as an economic one. The early 1990s in the former USSR were chaos wrapped in uncertainty. The planned economy that had once rationed bread and soap was replaced by something far wilder, the free market. Prices were freed overnight, and they soared in Moscow. A loaf of bread that cost 20 kopecks one day might cost 20 rubles the next. People's life savings evaporated. Teachers, engineers, and doctors, once respected Soviet professionals, suddenly found their salaries worthless. Some turned to street vending, others to smuggling, some even to crime. The black market became simply the market for the first time in generations. Private ownership was legal. Stores appeared selling Western goods. jeans, Pepsi, chewing gum. These years, it was intoxicating, but also humiliating. Because now, everything had a price. The social safety net that had guaranteed jobs, housing, and medical care disappeared almost as quickly as the red flag. Pensions were worthless. Hospitals demanded bribes. Bureaucrats became businessmen overnight, selling off state assets to the highest bidder, or to themselves. In the span of a few years, a new class of oligarchs emerged. Men who had once been mid-level officials or factory managers suddenly controlled fortunes beyond imagination. They bought fleets of cars, private jets, palaces. They sponsored sports teams and political campaigns. They dined in restaurants that charged more per meal than a teacher earned in a month. And for ordinary citizens, life grew harder than ever. Factories closed, unemployment spread. Homelessness, unthinkable in the Soviet years, became common. The streets of Moscow filled with old veterans selling medals, scientists hawking books, and babushkas begging for a change. And yet, amid the collapse, something remarkable happened. Freedom, chaotic, raw and real. Suddenly, anyone could start a business, speak their mind, travel abroad, or criticize the government. Things that had once been unthinkable. The press exploded with new voices. Radio and TV hosts debated politics live, sometimes shouting, sometimes weeping. Books that had been banned for 70 years flooded the shelves. Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn shared space with Stephen King. For a moment, it felt like anything was possible. But freedom, after so long in captivity, can be disorienting. Older generations found themselves lost, longing for the predictability, even the dullness of the old days. Many missed the certainty of the Soviet world, the fixed prices, the guaranteed job, the quiet pride of belonging to something vast. For the young, it was an awakening. They had grown up with propaganda posters and grey uniforms. Now they saw color. MTV, McDonald's, Coca-Cola. Western culture flooded in like a tidal wave. English became the language of opportunity. Moscow's billboards no longer showed tractors and workers. They showed models and Marlboros. It was exhilarating and empty. The Soviet world had collapsed so completely that even its memory began to feel unreal. The great parades, the collective songs, the promises of a radiant future, all of it faded into nostalgia, into a strange mixture of pride and embarrassment. Some turned to religion, rediscovering faith after decades of atheism. Churches reopened, priests returned. Others buried themselves in business or emigration, leaving the past behind. But for many, the ghost of the USSR never really left. Even today, decades later, it lingers in apartment blocks, in language, in habits, in the old red stars still carved into bridges and factory gates. The generation that came of age under communism still measures time in before and after. Before, when there was order, stability, and fear. After, when there was freedom, chaos, and loss. And for the youngest, those born after 1991, the Soviet Union is a story. A bedtime myth told by grandparents about a land where everything was shared. Nothing was for sale, and everyone stood in line together. But history never vanishes, it transforms. In the end, the Soviet Union was not just a country. It was an experiment in how humans might try to build a new kind of world. One without kings or gods. One built by workers' hands alone. It failed, often tragically. But its shadow still stretches across the modern age. A reminder that even the most powerful empires are mortal, and that ideas, however flawed, can outlive the states that birthed them. The Soviet dream began in fire and ended in silence, but its echoes, a struggle, of idealism, of human endurance, still whisper through the cracked concrete of every former republic. And somewhere in Moscow, beneath the winter snow, the walls of Gorky Park still stand, the same park where Stalin as cheerful life once paraded in 1937, now filled with couples walking hand in hand, children laughing, and music drifting softly from cafes. Different world, same people, still searching for meaning in the ruins of an idea. It is strange to think that an empire could simply fade, not collapse in flames, not fall to invasion, but dissolve quietly, like mist over frozen fields. And yet, that is how the Soviet Union ended for 70 years. It had promised to build paradise on earth, and for 70 years, it built something else instead, something vast, contradictory, and deeply human. Every brick, every factory, every song carried that same impossible dream, that people could be reshaped, that history could be commanded, that the future itself could be planned. It began with revolution, the hunger for justice, for equality, for meaning. It continued through fear, through purges and famine and war. It matured into habit, the routines of work, the grey apartments, the posters fading on the walls. And in the end, it drifted into memory. When the red flag was lowered from the Kremlin on December 26, 1991, the snow was falling over Moscow, silent, slow, eternal. The television cameras caught the flag as it descended, and for a moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Inside apartments across the country, people sat before flickering screens. Some cried, some shrugged, some poured another glass of vodka and stared at the curtains. Others simply turned off the light and went to bed, because after 70 years of believing, of enduring, of marching, it was finally over. But what had it all been for? That question still hangs in the air, in old songs, in cracked photographs, in the faces of those who lived it. For some, the Soviet Union was oppression, a prison of fear and lies. For others, it was safety, unity, and purpose, the certainty that tomorrow would come. Even if today was hard, both are true. Because the USSR was not just an idea. It was millions of lives woven together, full of contradictions and small, human moments, a teacher correcting homework by candlelight, a soldier warming his hands over a fueled stove, a factory worker humming to herself as the machines roared, a child in a pioneer uniform saluting the flag without really knowing why. History remembers the speeches, the parades, the leaders. But the real story, the one that lingers, is quieter. It's the sound of a shovel breaking frozen ground in Siberia. The smell of perfume on a dance floor in 1950s Moscow. The taste of black bread and tea after a long day's work. The touch of frost on a window pane and the warmth of someone's breath beside you. That was the Soviet Union. Not the slogans, not the borders, but the people who carried it, who believed in it, who survived it, and when they closed their eyes at night. Beneath portraits of Lenin or beneath peeling wallpaper, they dreamed, not of politics, but of peace, a small apartment, a child laughing, a table with bread and warmth and quiet. They dreamed of a better tomorrow, as humans always do. Now, decades later, the red stars have rusted, the statues have crumbled, but the dream, the yearning to build something good, something fair, still flickers. It flickers in every worker who takes pride in their craft, in every song sung softly in the dark, in every act of kindness that defies despair. Empires die, but people, their memories, their hopes, their tenderness endure. And so, as we drift to sleep, perhaps we can think of them, the millions who lived beneath that red sky, who worked and wept and hoped that all of it meant something. Because in the end, history is not made by flags or decrees. It's made by hands, tied strong, imperfect hands, building, holding, carrying the weight of dreams. And somewhere, in the long silence after the last anthem faded, those dreams settled gently into the earth, becoming not an empire, but a whisper that says, softly, we were here, we tried, we mattered.